you doing, YouTube fans? Welcome back to another episode of the Greenside Experience. Today we're going to talk about flush base with a shadow gap. What is it and how it's installed? Come on, I'll show you. So to understand what flush base is, let's talk about what standard baseboards are. So up here on our second floor, our clients decided to just go with the standard baseboards because flush baseboards actually cost more money. There's more labor involved. So as a matter of comparison, this is our standard installation. The drywall is installed all the way down to the floor, and our baseboard just slaps right over it and gets nailed. Easy install. It's standard. It's what almost every trim carpenter is used to. But when we go with a flush base application, it's completely different. Come on, I'll show you what we got there. All right, guys, so in this house, on the entire first floor, we're doing a flush base. And we also have a shadow gap on top of that base. So let me show you what that is. Over here, you can see we have our wall, typical drywall, but our baseboard is flush. It's on the same plane as the drywall. This is what we call flush base, and there's a gap here, an even reveal called a shadow gap, okay? Now to install it this way, it doesn't look like much after it's done. It still needs to be taped, but there's a lot more labor involved to do something like this. So in order to do this flush base application, we need to stop the drywall when it's hung above where it's going to finish. The baseboard is going to finish. So we put a nailer in before we start drywalling as a drywall stop, okay? That makes it much easier for the drywall contractors just to hang their board, hang their sheet, and drop it down onto the blocking, the temporary blocking that's set in place. Another good idea, and I'll touch on this later in the video, is to put blocking in between the stud bays. That's going to depend on what type of shadow gap bead that we use. So I'll talk about that a little later. But here you can see we left the drywall up. Now it's open for our baseboard. In this house, we have a 9.5-inch baseboard, and it's slightly less than 5/8 thick. Our drywall is 5/8 thick, so we needed to shim out our baseboard in order to plane it out. We also need room in the back of the baseboard to slide in our shadow bead, which is a piece like this. So essentially, our baseboard will fit in here. And then we take our shadow bead and we drop it in behind, okay? And we're going to give it a 1/2-inch reveal. And we do that but with a block. So they use a block that they just put in temporarily on top, and they sit their bead on top of the baseboard. Now they'll glue that, they'll spray glue that bead in and leave the blocking in until it sets. So when it's removed, we have our 1/2-inch shadow gap, okay? Now, what's important is on this Z channel that this back flange is bigger than our 1/2-inch gap. We actually have a 3/4 inch, so it allows us to slide it down back behind the baseboard. That way, when it's in and you peek down there, you don't see a gap between your baseboard and your Z channel or your Z gap. So the piece that we use to achieve the shadow gap is a trim tax piece called a Z channel. It's a 5/8 by 3/4 Z channel, or a Z bead as they call it. And that's what we use to tuck in and sit behind and give us the shadow gap on the trim. You can also use, but it's probably 4 times more expensive, an aluminum piece by Fry Reglet. Now, I've priced that out on this house. It was like 4 times the price of this. So this is a more economical way to go. So we have our tapers here installing the corner bead and the shadow gap trim. So let's take a look. So you can see this is very labor intensive for our drywall guys. They literally have to come back on a second trip to install all this. And not only do they have to install the Z channel, the shadow gap, but they have to coordinate it with the corner bead, the vertical corner beads. So you can see over here, this corner bead was left off when they drywall the house because it has to tie in to these shadow gap beads here. And if this was to go in beforehand, it would make it much more difficult to tie everything together and tape it. It'd be a lot more patchwork. So these get left off on the outside corners. So you can see in this area, you see our shims. This is the shimming used to bring the baseboard out flush or slightly proud of the drywall to line up with the edge of the Z-channel bead. That'll help push it out and get it flush. And then this is a much more complex way to do baseboard because there's so many steps and it's like dominoes. One thing has to happen before the next thing. Like here, for example, we've got an arched shadow gap opening that we're going to put in here. Now we can't finish any of this until this arched opening gets installed first. Once that gets installed, now we can install our baseboard. Once the baseboard is installed, we can come back and install all the shadow gap and then tape it. So if you're a homeowner or a client and you want to do a flush base with a shadow gap, you have to realize that it's going to cost more because there's much more labor involved than just going with the standard application baseboard. And if you're a builder and you have a client that asks for this, you have to be aware of all the extra steps that are required to achieve this look, and you have to be able to let your client know that it's going to cost more money. All right, guys, that wraps up our video on the shadow gap base, flush base. If you like this video, like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps our channel. And stay tuned for future videos. One of them will be about the staircase, how it's installed, how it's going to look finished. And see you next time.